All right, Ryan, what is on your radar today?
So as gas prices and inflation surged earlier this year, Senator Bernie Sanders and other progressives began hammering away at corporate greed, highlighting the way that monopolies were making record profits while gas prices were higher than underlying oil prices suggested they should be. Now, some in the White House wanted to push this message too, using as their backup their strong record on antitrust and corporate greed, thanks to the FTC's Lena Khan and the CFPB's Rohit Chopra. You started to see news segments like this one.
So, Rana, there's another factor I'm wondering about. 3M is the company that makes N95 face masks in addition to adhesives and all sorts of office supplies. According to a transcript of their earnings call in January, company executives applauded their own company for raising prices. The CFO saying, quote, "The team has done a marvelous job in driving price." Obviously, what Richard said is accurate in terms of issues, but I'm also wondering how much prices are going up because of corporate greed and companies and CFOs and CEOs taking advantage of this moment.
Well, it's a great question, and it's a question that the Biden administration has been asking. You've seen in recent weeks the White House saying that there is too much concentration of power in various industries, that companies have gotten too big, that they do have too much power over the economy. And that's something that I think that you're going to see continue as inflation continues throughout the rest of the year.
But a faction of White House economists fretted that there was an uncertain academic foundation to the claim that greed, corporate concentration, and price gouging was significantly enough behind the rising prices to allow the talking point to stand. Sure, it was a factor, they said, but was it enough? Now, for many on the left, that the White House was getting in its own way by splitting hairs was another example of the asymmetric warfare between Democrats and Republicans, who we can assume wouldn't let trivialities such as whether it was true get in the way of their messaging. It turns out, though, that even while the White House was getting the yips, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, the furthest thing on the planet from an anti-corporate populist organ, began asking pollsters to test some of that messaging. People familiar with the DCCC's planning told me. Starting around the middle of June, pollsters began testing versions of messaging that played off of a bill House Democrats passed in May to crack down on gas price gouging. Now, a DCCC aide put it simply, quote, "House Democrats voted for a bill that would prevent gas companies from price gouging. Every single Republican in the House of Representatives voted against it." Now, DCCC Chair Sean Patrick Maloney, who's actually facing a progressive primary challenge in New York, was a sponsor of the legislation. So the message tested in polling goes like this. With gas prices going up, Republican X voted against cracking down on gas price gouging. Meanwhile, they took X thousands of dollars from the oil and gas industry. Now, it tested well, said one person involved. And put it like this, quote, "Number one, everyone is pissed off at gas prices. Number two, you can connect it very easily to oil and gas. And all these a-holes have taken from oil and gas. Well, frankly, so have many Democrats," he added. Now, Matt Cartwright, a populist Democrat who represents a Trump district in Northeast Pennsylvania, highlighted the bill in one of his ads. Take a look.
Pennsylvanians are hurting right now, and a whole lot of it is because of gas prices. They affect everything we buy. So here's what I've been doing. I helped pass a bill to go after the big oil companies that are gouging people. And I'm helping turn local shale gas into regular car gas by supporting a new plant right here in northeastern Pennsylvania. Lots of jobs and cheaper gas. I'm Matt Cartwright. I approve this message. I work for you.
Now, making the link between inflation more broadly and corporate corruption and price gouging has also been tested, though the oil and gas industry makes an easier to identify villain than, say, big milk or big bread. Making an argument land in a 30-second ad isn't easy, so candidates need to start from a place where voters are open to hearing what they're saying, and the link between Republicans and big oil is strong enough in the public's imagination already. I talked to Ben Tulchin of Tulchin Research, which did the polling for the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016 and 2020, and also for Eric Adams for New York mayor. And he said that hitting the GOP for their coziness with oil companies was a smart move that's backed up by the data that he has seen. He said, quote, "Economic messaging is challenging, so it's the best option available to Democrats. Tying Republicans to big oil is very credible, so there's a foundation to work with." Now, the DCCC's willingness to dabble in populist politics suggests a broader path forward for Democrats in the wake of the signing of this Inflation Reduction Act, which included the biggest investment in climate spending in history. The bill was watered down by West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, who profits handsomely from his own coal company. Yet it was opposed by every single Republican in both chambers of Congress. Now, as the clean energy industry grows, those corporations will continue funneling money into the political system. If more Democrats swear off oil and gas money, the party has an opportunity to paint Republicans as the party of big oil, yoking them with high gas prices and the ever-worsening consequences of climate change. Instead, though, Democratic primaries are suddenly becoming contests between nuclear-powered super PACs with deep-pocketed groups like AIPAC and Democratic Majority for Israel, billionaire Reid Hoffman's interventions, and proliferating crypto super PACs, all coming in to boost centrist corporate candidates and beat back progressive ones. The result means the party has fewer candidates who can credibly make the populist critique of corporate profiteering. In Rhode Island's 2nd District, for instance, State Treasurer Seth Magaziner has dabbled in the populist gas price rhetoric, but it lands flat in the face of his more temperate tenure in the treasurer's office and the moderate hue of his campaign. His opponent, David Siegel, on the other hand, has spent his career challenging corporate interests, both as a local elected official and as a federal advocate for the group Demand Progress, though he trails in public polls. Now, here he is kind of laying out some of this messaging at a forum in Rhode Island yesterday.
I think that those of us on the stage seem to agree on a lot. There might be some differences in points of emphasis, but a lot of agreement. And despite efforts by the powers that be to divide us across the country, most people across this country agree with most of us when it comes to most of the things that we've talked about today. And so the question we need to ask is, why doesn't anything seem to change? Or why is what progress we do make always insufficient? Or why are we having to defend against backsliding on such important issues? And the answer, as I said at the start, is the influence of corporate special interests and political corruption through a variety of different vectors that plague our system. And since my very first run for office 20 years ago, when I ran against an entrenched board machine that was opposing living wages in Providence, through my time in the Assembly when I pushed back against the banks or worked to make our tax system more progressive by restoring the capital gains tax, to my time working as a federal advocate, for instance, to help revive the anti-monopoly movement to protect consumers and small businesses and workers against outside-sized power wielded by corporations, I have demonstrated a willingness to push back against those structures that are the fundamental impediments to progress. And it's why I'm not taking corporate PAC money in this race, and why I'm not taking money from registered corporate lobbyists.
And so, Emily, I think this Rhode Island race is a super interesting one because it could actually flip Republican. The Republicans have a popular mayor who's running there. That Rhode Island was expected to go down to just one seat, but they retained two. So it is a Dem-leaning seat, but it's certainly up for grabs. And I think the DCCC is actually right on when it's moving in the direction of this more populist messaging, but they're trying to do it with candidates who are thoroughly corrupted from their time using the kind of DCCC's and the Democratic Party's old ways of campaigning and messaging. And so it feels like if they're actually serious about winning races like this on a populist message, don't they need to kind of almost put their thumb on the scale for the populist candidates rather than allowing somebody like a Seth Magaziner, who's the son of a famous kind of Democrat, Ira Magaziner, just kind of waltz into the primary.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully the voters put that pressure on the DCCC to you sort of walk the walk and not just talk the talk. I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, is it better that they're talking that way than that they aren't talking that way? Is that a sign that they're in some ways responsive to shifts in public opinion? Absolutely. But I mean, from the Republican Party, this has happened sort of in a populist direction in all of the years since the Tea Party. They would talk a big game, and then when it came time to actually do something, they would do absolutely nothing. In fact, they would continue doing the opposite. And so I think you're absolutely right that if they want to talk this talk, they should walk the walk. And I think it's up to voters to decide, if they like this messaging, whether or not they want people who actually implement the messaging, and hopefully it, turns out that they have more power than the DCCC does. But it's also just such an interesting question of as you were reading your radar, defining populism, because the Inflation Reduction Act, for instance, ended up getting the support of Exxon. And it's like, well, how do you define populism in this type of situation? Is it, somebody who wants to appeal to the Rust Belt voters by, bringing back the American energy industry and sort of working class voters around the country, or is it the climate sort of reformers, or is it some combination of both? It's just the definition of populism. Obviously, there's always different sort of partisan. There's always partisan definitions of that. But in this case, it's really interesting just talking about energy.
Right, and to me, it has to be kind of a multi-stage process. So, right now, for Democrats to actually pass populist kind of, let's say, gas price legislation, it's going to be a messaging bill in the House that people know is not going to pass the Senate, and so that's effectively what this price gouging bill was. Like, look, we need a bill that says we're going to crack down on price gouging. We're going to all vote for it. Or the Republicans are going to vote against it, which I don't even understand. If it's just a messaging bill, and you're a Republican, just vote for it. Just tell your voters you're against price gouging. Like, it's not like the Senate is going to necessarily pass this. It's not like the Senate's going to pass this bill anyway. So they do that. Then if they stop taking big oil money, and that's absolutely crucial. They have to stop being in hock to big oil. Then perhaps the next time that they do climate legislation, it can be genuinely populist legislation rather than something that Exxon looks at and is like, we'd rather that all of this clean energy stuff wasn't in here, but there aren't any sticks against us, and we're heavily invested in clean energy technology now anyway, because we're we're a $1 trillion corporation that is able to diversify. So we're okay with this. Like, you want to get to a place where Exxon says, no, this is a bad bill. We hate this. But they're not there yet by any stretch.
Well, and then on the flip side, there are a lot of special interests in clean energy now too, as you just mentioned. Like, Exxon is one of those players, and so if you want to, the bottom line is the people at the DCCC are establishmentarians, they're institutionalists, they're not populists, and so even if they sort of stumble onto populist messaging, there are going to be different corporate interests that appeal to them, and it's sort of like on the Republican side, they can talk a really big populist game, but if you're talking about bringing back jobs to the United States and et cetera, well, then you're also going to have wide open ears to the special interests in corporate America who want to make that happen and can indeed create some really good jobs, just in the same way that clean energy companies can get the country towards goals that you would probably support, climate goals that you would probably support. But when you're putting the establishmentarians in charge of making that change, they are never going to. You're not going to teach that old dog any new tricks. Like, they're going to continue to be establishmentarians.
Yeah, and I know we got to probably move on to your radar pretty quickly, but one last point would be, to me, and I'm curious how you feel about this, the difference between the Republican Party's ability to try and transform more fundamentally and the Democratic Party's is the media. So there was a right-wing media that would pick up on this messaging. And if there was, say, a Seth Magazine or David Siegel race on the Republican side, then the media would start covering that and start telling voters, actually, this guy who's in the lead right now, this Magaziner character, he's a corporate Republican, a corporate Democrat, and here's why, this other challenger has a better track record in the past, and also therefore is more electable in the general election, because it's not just about being pure and winning a primary. It's about what kind of populist message is going to appeal broadly in a general election. MSNBC and CNN are not going to do that. The New York Times is not going to do that. And so it's really left to kind of the independent research of voters, and there aren't enough voters who are paying close enough attention in primaries to really suss that out. And so without that superstructure of a media over top of it, it really becomes difficult to see how this kind of populist messaging breaks through to Democratic primary voters. So that, to me, is the big difference between the two, and why the Democrats are kind of stunted in their evolution. What's your read on that?
No, I think that's right, and I think that's why what you're picking up on is really important in terms of like the DCCC being at least responsive to public opinion in style, if not in substance, because to some extent style is always substance, but that means that they're recognizing at least, like it's actually helpful that they at least recognize the direction that public opinion is going in, because that does force some action. It might not be like the broad sweep that is necessary and urgent, but it's better than nothing. And like AOC is a really good example, I think, from that perspective. So like somebody who the media actually does treat really well, like she does get to go on CNN and MSNBC, and she was on magazine covers, and she is generally treated as somebody who's a hero in the sort of national drama that is our politics, and that does exist for the left. And even if they do that to Nancy Pelosi too, of course, but in different circumstances they will, because they know the public really likes the idea of this young populist bartender who has all of these different ways that can, the narrative there is really good for them and they like it, but they would never have that narrative about somebody on the right unless it's Liz Cheney. And so yes, I do think that's a huge, that is a huge element in all of this. And by the way, before we wrap, a little inside baseball. Some people I see ask, like, how can you like, this is a YouTube show, how could you have to rap so quickly? Like, don't you? We do. We have a schedule. Right. Sometimes we have to follow the schedule. We have to keep the blocks to a certain time period. So that's a little inside baseball for everyone watching.
Right. Yes, it is the internet, but things are still limited. There are still limits.
Well, that's great points, Ryan. And we'll see what the DCCC does.
Yep, and we got to move on to your radar next.
That's right.